Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. So today we're going to do something special, and we're just going to pit the golems against each other, in terms of which one is the best and in what order do we rank them. So we're going to be ranking the golems by their effectiveness, what they're useful for, what they're not useful for. We're going to talk about their strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to do so in order of last to first. Now, for this reason, I have picked a character that I can reset my skills so that we can talk about each individual one, and we're going to go ahead and dump all of our points into the golems for now. Now, the first golem, or rather the last golem on the list, the one that just seems to have the least usefulness out of all of the golem types, is most definitely the blood golem. The blood golem is a weird amalgamation of ideas that used to work really good right up until the point it just kind of got absolutely trashed. Now, for those of you who remember, back in the day, you used to be able to use the blood golem for nigh immortality by combining the blood golem together with the Iron Maiden curse. Just by simply utilizing the Iron Maiden curse and the blood golem together, you could potentially stay alive infinitely because the damage that was done to the Iron Golem would get reflected, and that count as the Iron Golem dishing out, or sorry, the Iron Golem would count as the blood golem dishing out damage directly to the target, which was, interesting. And when it converts 140% or 7% of all physical damage from any of the monsters that hit it with Iron Maiden, it essentially allowed the Necromancer to achieve a kind of immortality that was a little OP. After a little while, the developers decided that this was broken and they didn't like it. And because of this, they kind of just like stunted the Iron Golem back into obscurity. Now, does the Iron Golem still leech life? Yes, it does. But due to the fact that it is, well, extremely slow in attacking, and the damage of the Blood Golem is just pathetic by comparison to most other types of damage, it barely achieves the goal at which it was designed to achieve, which is, of course, to keep you alive by stealing life. And, if we were to go out somewhere relatively simple like Cold Plains and just let the monsters wail on us, you can see the Blood Golem's effect of trying to keep us alive isn't quite as grand as it should be. It works slightly. It's a good thing my Arm of King Leoric kicked in and put a wall around me. Otherwise, I think we would have died right there. Overall, the Blood Golem requires just way too much investment to become viable, and this is one of the biggest issues with the Blood Golem in general, is just that, well, it doesn't really do very well, even with, like, maxed out points. And for the most part, you don't have maxed out points to invest in the golem. So as it turns out, when you're leveling up your character and you want to choose how to divide your points into your golems, you're more often than not going to do something like this. And this is not going to be very effective for a golem in general. You can see he went from like 765 damage to 100 to 377, which is relatively nothing. His HP went down considerably from like 55,000 to 15,288, and so forth and so on. Now, the reason why you would do this, and of course we can also put some strength points in so we can use our equipment, which brings him up a little bit to 19k, because now we have our plus the skills on. But for the most part, when it comes to the golem, he's just not the greatest. His damage output is very low. His HP is okay, but as a tank, he's definitely not the strongest. There are two other golems that tank better than the Blood Golem in a myriad of ways. So the Blood Golem really offers only one thing over the other golems, which is a passive life regeneration by simply hitting the targets. Now, one of the biggest issues with this passive life regeneration is just simply the fact that, well, it doesn't function very quickly. If you go to the Amazon Basin page on the Blood Golem, what you'll find is that all golems essentially have this issue where they are stuck with a 15 frame delay on the attack rate. This means that they're never able to attack more than 15 frame AI delay plus whatever the delay of the actual golem is, which if we run that on a calculator is something along the lines of 25 divided by 15. And of course, it's not 15, it's 15 plus whatever else it is. So we're probably better off doing something like 17, which is more like it. And we end up with an attack of 1.47 attacks per second, which is pretty low. These are his EIS frames right here. So as you can see, like he, even with a large amount of IAS, he can still only go down to like 11 frames, which essentially means that he's just not going to attack very fast at all, pretty much ever. And since his entire goal is to attack things, and by attacking things, leeching life, he kind of fails at that regard. In terms of tanking, like I said, there are two better tanks than him. The first better tank is the Fire Golem. The Fire Golem is a much better tank than he is. And, let me move myself over to the other side of the screen since I am showing off wonderful skills that need to be shown on the right-hand side of the screen. Weep. And we can flip us around. Flip around, round, 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 right around. Ooh. Boom. There we go. So the Fire Golem is a much better tank than the Clay Golem for one particular reason. The ability of the Holy Fire attacks and draws things in, which is actually quite interesting. So as a tank, monsters tend to hate the Fire Golem. Does the Fire Golem do much damage? No, it really doesn't. Even maxed out, even with all the synergies, it's not really that great on damage. Neither is the Blood Golem, to be perfectly honest. But the Fire Golem does a better job tanking because it draws aggro away from you and away from your minions in general, which does make it a little bit better than the Blood Golem in terms of tanking. The Clay Golem, on the other hand, is far better for tanking because anything that touches it gets slowed down by a rather large degree. Not just what it attacks, but also any monster that touches it at all gets slowed down. It's part of the mechanic of how the Clay Golem works. So in terms of tanking, the Blood Golem is trash. In terms of the actual life-stealing effect that it offers, it doesn't do it well enough to actually be useful. It just, in general, acts as sort of like a passive regeneration. The other thing is that if the monster is immune to physical, you get no regeneration whatsoever. And the Golem himself just tends to be really poor in terms of tankiness. Another interesting thing to talk about with the Blood Golem is that investing into the Blood Golem isn't really worth doing. The Blood Golem pretty much just levels up, for the most part, its HP and its physical damage, which does in fact affect the golem, but doesn't really affect its overall tankiness as much as you would think. Capping out the golem gives it a total of 38,818 life. However, if we were to go the other direction, which is to cap out Golem Mastery instead, you'll see that he has 48,208 life. In other words, capping out Golem Mastery for life is always better than dipping points into Blood Golem itself, because you always end up with a higher life Golem with Golem Mastery than you do with stacking it into the Golem itself. And in fact, let's see here. I believe I did this a little bit wrong here. So we go... There we go. So we got 28,000 or 26,906 by stacking Golem Mastery. And let's go the other direction. And we've got 27,391. So Golem Mastery itself makes the Golem tankier, gives it more attack rating, gives it more run walk speed, and in general just tends to work better than the Blood Golem points. On top of this, if you are using the Blood Golem, let's say for instance you've chosen to use the Blood Golem, if you were to put the points into Golem Mastery instead of the points into the Blood Golem itself, and you just put 1 point in all of the Golems, you will now have all of the golems as viable options for you to use. So you could use the fire golem, the iron golem, the blood golem, and the clay golem all together. However, if you go the other direction, it doesn't really work as well, because the blood golem, although it does give life to the other golems, it doesn't give as much life as the Golem Mastery does. As you can see, Golem Mastery at level 39 gives 780%. The Blood Golem at a 20 synergy, so 20 synergy times 5, gives a total of 100% increased life. So even though the Blood Golem does give increased life, it doesn't give anywhere near as much increased life as Golem Mastery does. And it's just, yeah. You could potentially still max it out to increase the life of all of the other golems as well. But in terms of its effectiveness, the Blood Golem is just one of the worst golems on the tree. It has been ever since they nerfed it back in the Iron Maiden days. Moving on to number 3 on the list. And let's talk about number 3. Number 3 is most definitely the Fire Golem. The Fire Golem doesn't really have a lot going for it. It's never really quite worked properly, and you might be asking what I mean by it never really quite works properly. Well, the Fire Golem has always been immune to fire, which is something that is very odd for a monster that also happens to have absorption. So it has 97% absorption of fire, but if you take a look on the Amazon Basin page for the Fire Golem, what you'll find is that the Fire Golem has an innate resistance to fire, which makes it utterly immune to fire in all degrees. So fire resistance, 175%. Combined, of course, with the summon resistance, which means that our summon resistance is currently at 67%. So if you take a calculator and you combine those two at 175 plus 67%, you end up with 242% fire resistance, which means that even if a monster had Conviction Aura, there's a very good chance that your Fire Golem will probably still be immune. Let's assume you were going up against, I don't know, Mephisto. And Mephisto has a Conviction Aura of level 20. And level 20 Conviction Aura is negative 125%. So negative 125, even if it applied this way, but it doesn't because it's 1/5 penalty. That would still only bring your Fire Golem down to 117. Which basically means that your Fire Golem is essentially, for all intents and purposes, always immune to fire in every single degree. So let's take a look at absorption. And let's see how absorption works. So the ceiling of absorption of 40% absorb, so there can never be a net gain from percent absorb, thus performs a similar function to resistance when current life is greater than maximum life, total damage absorbed, effective percentage damage decrease as a result of resistance, and percentage absorb as follows. So it can only go up to 40%. So despite the fact that the Fire Golem says that it has 97% fire damage absorption, it doesn't really work that way. The order of operations for absorption, that's what we need, which is also to point out something here. So lightning resistance 75%, 20% lightning absorb, and 20% absorb. Decreases 60 to 15. Yeah, so the order of operations is that the resistance decreases the damage first, then the lightning absorption absorbs damage, and then the flat absorption absorbs damage, and then the healing is applied. Okay, so follow my logic here. If the Fire Golem is always immune to fire, in basically every situation that he can be immune to fire, with the exception of maybe like PvP and a Sunder Charm, then this means that the 97% fire absorption is 100% useless in all situations. So one of the gimmicks of the fire golem, which is to be immune to fire in essentially every way, shape, and form, is very silly because he cannot heal himself from any fire damage because his fire resistance is always to the point where he takes no fire damage. And if you take no fire damage, there's nothing to absorb. And if you absorb nothing, then that means you're not healing from fire damage like you should be. And so the entire fire gimmick of the fire golem starts to break apart. Now, what's the other fire gimmick of the fire golem? Well, the other fire gimmick of the fire golem is the ability to aggro things. And we talked about this briefly with the blood golem, stating that the fire golem was a better tank than the blood golem. And it's 100% true. The fire golem has the ability to aggro huge swaths of monsters and cause them to attack him before anything else. And this just simply has to do with the fact that he hits them first. He hits them first with holy fire before you ever get there. So if you're running along in an area and you're fighting things, the fire golem is going to inevitably pulse the holy fire aura onto the monster, which is going to allow it to dish out fire damage to that monster and pull aggro. The pulse of the fire damage is constant and never ending, and so it does work surprisingly well for one purpose at least alone, which is to pull aggro. On top of this, you can also recast him, which is very good, and that's something that unfortunately you cannot do. Oh man, I got blasted. I'm assuming that is Great Marsh. One of the reasons why nobody likes to go to Great Marsh. That was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. Dude, I walked out, just got blasted. Got sugar blasted. So basically, when it comes to the fire golem makes a more effective tank because it keeps the aggro off of you. However, in that particular case, I don't think anything was. That doesn't matter because those attacks go straight through the golem and out the other side, which is one of, unsurprisingly, one of the Necromancer's most insidious weaknesses is the ability for monsters to pierce. In fact, in the majority of cases, like these guys right here that have the ability to pierce, are more often than not, more deadly than anything else, just simply because if I stand behind the golem like an idiot, they can pierce straight through the golem and hit me anyway. Which a lot of many necromancers have died to piercing attacks like lightning, and also the spear cats over here. As you can see, he does a really good job holding aggro on the targets. I mean, I can pretty much just run around in here. I can do whatever I want to, and the monsters generally don't attack me because the fire golem is doing his job, which is, he only has one job, and his one job is basically just to pull aggro. His damage is rather pathetic. As you can clearly see, he's never going to kill any of these monsters, not in 1,000 years. Not maxed out, not with all of the synergy bonuses in the world, not with all of the bonuses to every single golem. He's never going to kill anything on his own. And this is due to the fact that he's using a version of Holy Fire, which is unfortunately just not the greatest. It's unsynergized, and although it is a really high level now due to the changes from Diablo 2 Resurrected, it's a much higher level than it ever was before. As you can see here, it says that he's doing 1,568 fire damage on hit, and he's doing a 330 holy fire damage in a pulse radius around him. This also is affected by the double damage, which was added in the Diablo 2 Resurrected patch for all of the holy auras. So basically what they did is they made it so that at the edges of the aura, it was 330, and in the center of the aura, basically in melee range, it's always going to be double that. So it's 660 fire damage or holy fire damage when you're in the center of the aura. As you can see, he's pretty tanky, and he can sit there and take multiple strikes and multiple spears from the Thorned Hulks, and also, of course, the spear cats that are constantly attacking him. And with relative limited help, like for instance using something like the Life Tap Curse on him, you can pretty much make him mostly invincible. And since you can recast him, it is relatively easy to get him back up and running. The only real issue with the Fire Golem's ability to recast is the cost of mana. So the Fire Golem gets a big a big ding here for its ridiculous mana cost. And to show you the mana cost, I really have to go to a character who has a maxed out version of this fire golem. So let's go online to a character that is actually running a maxed out version of the fire golem. And that is, of course, my Fire Necromancer, which is very fun. The Fire Necromancer has a version of the Fire Golem, which is like upwards of level 60, I believe. And the cost of the Golem just continues to rise and rise and rise. And I'm pretty sure that I've talked about this plenty of times before, is that the Fire Golem tends to have this problem because back in the old days, you used to be able to cast him repeatedly from inside of town to basically kill people. And it worked fairly well, to be perfectly honest. So they increased the cost of the mana to prevent people from being able to spam cast him, which was the easiest solution to the problem. But as you can see here on mine, I have I'm not missing my Doojanks. Where's my plus ridiculous fire golem head? Of course, is this it? Oh, it's 4. There's a +4. So we've got, what is that, level 47 at 418. I'm pretty sure I had a lot higher than that. And missing summoning charms. But you can get the fire golem up to a ridiculously high level. Of course, I've got plenty of summoning charms in here. Let's go ahead and play around with these real quick. Summoning, no, that's Druid. We don't want Druid. We want Necromancer. We want the Necromancy. Alright, so here's our Fire Golem now at level 51. And as you can see, at level 51, he currently costs 450 mana. I only have 511, which means that every time I cast him, yes, every time I cast him, pretty much all my mana is gone, which does prevent the ability to replace him several times if need be. So if he dies too often, or if he's unfortunately needing to be repositioned multiple times, which is something that you definitely want to do, and it's a big positive on the Golem in general, is the ability to reposition him. And this is something that we need to talk about for a second, because it often is a problem with small, tight spaces. This is something that a lot of people don't realize when they're in, like, say, Maggot Lair, which is an issue, is that when you're in Maggot Lair, and you're fighting monsters, a lot of the times your Golem, especially due to the way that Golem Mastery works, tends to be faster than all of your other minions. Because he is faster than all your other minions, he will often block doorways. And this means that you will run into situations where he is essentially making it very difficult for your army to actually get to the monsters and dish out damage. So recasting your Golem, any of your Golems, is very important because you want to be able to force your Golems to be, like, in the back of the pack. In fact, when you're in places like Maggot Lair, you should almost always be casting your Golem at the back of the pack rather than at the front of the pack, specifically because if you don't, your Golem will block all your skeletons from being able to get through, and your skeletons do, let's be honest, way more damage than your Golem ever will. But you can see in places like this, where we have large groups of monsters, he is holding aggro on pretty much everything in the room with relative ease, which is one of the reasons why he at least got the number 3 spot over the Blood Golem, because he's a way better tank than the Blood Golem will ever be. And that's actually kind of sad, because the tanking is really the only thing that the Blood Golem can do, with the exception of giving you a very minor and very inefficient life regen, which only functions when, you know, there's actually something around to hit, and as long as it's not physically immune, and as long as he's not slowed, and as long as he's not frozen. You kind of get the point, right? Now, moving on to the number 2 spot, I had to think long and hard about this, and quite honestly, the number 2 spot goes to the Iron Golem. Now, the Iron Golem has some serious drawbacks. It also has some very serious upsides. And one of the main issues with the Iron Golem is the conflict between these. First off, if the Iron Golem dies, you lose your item, and I did recently put out an entire video on the number of items, about 20 items, that are essentially really good for making iron golems out of. And if you keep your eyes on most of these, you'll have a pretty handy amount of items just sitting around on mules and things like that that you can utilize at any given time to make iron golems out of. And that is my top 20 iron golem video, which is right here. Top 20 iron golem weapons, which is essentially sorted by cost, availability, and utility. Now, making your golem out of something like a beast is not exactly very good of an idea, because if your iron golem dies, well, it's kind of poopy. You can also potentially make your iron golem slow targets by giving him slow target items, but the problem with this is that the iron golem only applies the slow when he hits the target, and not when he's actually, like being hit, like the clay golem can. This is one of the big benefits of the clay golem over the iron golem, is that the clay golem is just the tankiest of the lot, and by far makes it so that it is very difficult to beat him in terms of locking down monsters, just simply for efficiency's sake. Like, if you're just trying to make a monster unkillable, or sorry, make a monster useless, or essentially just neuter them entirely so that they can do nothing to you, the clay golem just tends to work better. So in terms of that, the iron golem really can't compete, but the iron golem does have a large amount of utility in what you can potentially make him out of. And there are tons and tons of different choices for you to make them out of. And I would strongly recommend that you check out my top 20 iron golem video if you want a good list of items to hang on to for your iron golem. Now, what are the problems with the iron golem? Well, the problems with the iron golem are immense. Number one, the iron golem tends to be unrecastable, right? So this is an issue with pretty much any iron golem, is that, well, if I had the clay golem, or if I was using the blood golem, or if I was using the fire golem, which are all the other choices, I can potentially recast them at any point to a different location, essentially translocating them to somewhere else and using that as my ability to get the golem out of the way. So if I'm in a place like, for instance, the Far Oasis, where I'm in the maggot layer and I'm trying my best to go through this place to, kill these monsters, if the iron golem is not being an efficient killer of monsters, if he's not better than my skeletons and he's blocking the way from my skeletons, well, I can't recast him. I can't move him out of the way. Which basically makes him unrepositionable, with the exception of something like teleport on an amulet. And even in that case, you're not really repositioning him so much as you're just consolidating all the entire army in one place, which does make it okay for, that particular purpose. Because now he's no longer in the front of the pack, everybody's in the front of the pack, right? So you got a little bit of a leeway there. Another one of the deficiencies of the Iron Golem is that while his damage can be increased by utilizing weapons of various types, as we talked about earlier, the golems all have the same horrible attack rate of 15 frame delay, which means that no matter how good his damage becomes, well, he's still going to attack at the speed of snail, which is rather unfortunate, which relegates him to usefulness in other ways. One particular usefulness that he's very good for is applying open wounds, which is essentially the only way that the Necromancer can apply open wounds, is through the Iron Golem, unless he's going to do it himself. Iron Golems have the ability to apply open wounds if the weapon that you are utilizing has open wounds on it, and they can also apply poison if the weapon that you're using has poison on it, which can make them a very effective way to arrest regeneration on monsters like, say, Uber Diablo, or various other choices. However, he does have to actually hit them, which can also be a pretty big issue, as he doesn't really have very good attack rating, and he does get a little bit of an attack rating buff from Golem Mastery, which I highly recommend that you max out. In fact, if you're going to do an Iron Golem at any point, my recommendation is that you always max out Golem Mastery first. Iron Golem itself is not particularly very effective. The interesting thing about the Iron Golem skill is that the Iron Golem skill doesn't really offer much in the way of increases for the Iron Golem. It's one of the reasons why Metal Grid doesn't work very effectively, because, well, It doesn't really matter if you have maxed out Iron Golem or not. You can have level 60 Iron Golem. It still doesn't really matter because Golem Mastery and Summon Resist are always far more important than the Iron Golem skill will ever be. And I can demonstrate this relatively effectively. So, assuming, of course, that you have your Iron Golem set up and he is utilizing all the abilities, and I'm going to unfortunately kill him really quickly. This means that you have to put points into Golem Mastery, Summon Resist, and you have to put points into the Iron Golem. Now, the Iron Golem itself, when you level it up, doesn't really give you very much in terms of survivability or anything. It's really the Thorns damage and the defense bonus that he gets. So if you cap out Iron Golem, he gets a relatively large amount of defense at 1,365, and he gets basically no life. See his life at 4,949? It's pretty pathetic, especially when you consider that other golems, like for instance the clay golem at 1 point have 10,623, the blood golem has 15,288, and even the fire golem beats him at 5,115 with 1 point into the ability. In fact, if I were to level up all of these to maximum with the same 1 point in Golem Mastery and 1 point in Summon Resist, you'll see that they just generally top out over the Iron Golem with ease. What are you actually getting from leveling the Iron Golem? Not much. That's kind of the big issue with leveling the Iron Golem, is that the Iron Golem is one of the worst ones to actually put points into, because the only thing that you're really getting is the Thorns damage itself, combined with the defense bonus that you get from the actual Iron Golem. So you do also get a passive defense bonus, which does make it less likely for monsters to hit him, but how much defense does he actually have? The moral of the story with defense is that if you don't have enough defense, it doesn't really matter. Once you reach a point where you have enough defense, then defense actually starts to matter. Like if you have 1,000 defense and I give you an additional 1,365 so that you're at 2,365 defense, well, I haven't done much of anything for you at all, because the difference between 1,000 and 2,500 defense is moot. You're still going to get smacked around like a little girl at a smacking contest, and there's really nothing that I can do about that. However, if we're going from, say, like 6,000 defense to 8,000 defense, then that's a big difference, and 6,000 to 8,000 can actually make a considerable difference in how often that you get hit. So leveling the actual Iron Golem skill is kind of poopy. This means that if you want the best Iron Golem that you can possibly get, you're more often relegated to leveling up a different path. So a maxed Iron Golem would probably look something like this, which is 20 points into Golem Mastery, 1 point into Summon Resist, and then you would most likely just simply put 1 point in Iron Golem, and then you could cap out Blood Golem if you really wanted to get the highest HP pool for your Iron Golem, because there is a synergy for Blood Golem to give more HP to the Iron Golem, which would essentially give your Iron Golem a maximum HP of 10,192, which is actually kind of pathetic when you look at some of the other golems that have 55,000 HP, and the clay golem, which even with 1 point has 24,882, which if we cap him out ends up at 43,901. And the clay golem is just insane. Now, the Iron Golem itself does have other issues, like, for instance, if you die, the Iron Golem dies, and you also lose the item. And this is rather unfortunate, because if you make your Iron Golem out of something rather expensive, like, for instance, make him out of, like, an Ethereal Reaper's Toll or something, depending on what you end up making him out of, and you walk outside and you're fighting monsters, let's say you go to Frigid Highlands, and there happens to be a bunch of spear cats there, and the spear cats end up killing you for whatever reason, because you're stupid and you stood behind your golem, this could potentially lead to your golem being lost. Now, none of the other golems, none of them have this issue. The clay golem can be recast whenever it dies at any time whatsoever. The Fire Golem can be recast whenever it dies at any time whatsoever, provided that you have the mana. And the Blood Golem can also be recast if it dies, provided that you have the mana. This means that the Iron Golem is the only one in the list that unfortunately can be lost permanently, and then you have to provide another item for the Iron Golem to be utilized. However, the strong utility of the Iron Golem being able to apply open wounds, crushing blow, auras of various types, including things like Infinity, Insight, Beast, the cheaper version, which would be Hustle. You could also utilize things like Lawbringer for Sanctuary Aura if you wanted to be silly. There's tons of various ways that you can utilize the Iron Golem to your advantage in a very utilitarian manner. The question is what you are getting worth what you are losing, which is a imminently deployable tank in any situation possible. Imagine that you're in an area, and let's just use the clay golem as an example, that you're in an area and you're having trouble. You can always apply your golem to any situation. Like if you feel like someone is attacking you, you can cast your clay golem in any position, making it eminently easy to get those attacks off. And essentially prevent yourself from dying by providing an easy alternative option for the monsters to attack. And being able to cast your golem is a really big thing that you lose when you utilize the Iron Golem, and it's rather unfortunate. I do still think that the Iron Golem is extremely powerful, and if you're willing to put up with the occasional loss of those powerful items that you're utilizing in the golem, or if you take a look at my video and you look at all of the various things that you could potentially utilize for the Iron Golem, you know, for instance, the top 20 items that you can potentially have in your top 20 items that you can have for your Iron Golem and keep those on hand on a regular basis, you can get some very good usefulness out of the Iron Golem. And I do think that the Iron Golem's ability to give you a open wounds option is one of the strongest things on the Golem list. Unfortunately, the Iron Golem did not beat out, in my opinion, the strongest Golem on the list, which is without a doubt the Clay Golem. Now, the Clay Golem does have some drawbacks, but as the number one golem, it is the number one golem for a lot of various reasons. And I feel like we need to even just like bring up a little notepad here. That's some stuff from Kingdom Come Deliverance too. That was a really fun game, by the way. If you haven't checked it out, I got a full playthrough on my live streams. Now, the Clay Golem has a lot of positives. First off, if we just write down pros and we start listing off the pros of the Clay Golem, number one, he's a really good tank. He's not only the best tank, but he's the best tank by a mile. If your goal is just simply to have something to absorb massive amounts of damage and survive in a very, very good fashion, the Clay Golem works extremely well for this. Now, the only golem that beats the Clay Golem in sheer tankiness is the Fire Golem, just simply because he's able to draw aggro on all the monsters simultaneously. Something that the Clay Golem unfortunately cannot replicate. However, usually you're not really too worried about the massive amount of monsters, so much as you are worried about the one monster, and the Clay Golem is definitely the best at tanking one monster at a time. So if you're fighting, for instance, a Bale, or if you're fighting Diablo, or if you're fighting Duriel, or if you're fighting Andariel, or if you're fighting some ridiculously tanky like elite monster, any single monster that has the ability to basically swat you out of existence, the Clay Golem can tank really, really well. And this comes in multiple different reasons. Number one is he is a very high HP, extremely high HP. In fact, if you look at all of the golems by the amount of HP that they have, we cap out all the golems and make them equal, you'll see that the Fire Golem only has 10,535, the Iron Golem has 10,192, the Blood Golem has 55,087, and the Clay Golem is at 43,901. Now, even though the Clay Golem has less HP than the than the Blood Golem, and the Blood Golem also has the ability to leech life. This, however, does not change the fact that the Blood Golem doesn't win in this contest, and it has to do with another reason, which is essentially the slows target application. So the Clay Golem has the ability to apply slow to not only who he hits, but also who hits him, which is something that is extremely powerful when you're talking about slowing down other targets. And in combination with something like Decrepify can actually be absolutely devastating to lock down large groups of monsters at a time and essentially neuter them, making them utterly useless. Now, I do think that the Fire Golem works a little bit better in terms of pulling aggro of large groups, but as you can see, he still works pretty effectively to sit in the middle of a pack of monsters and overall do his job. Now, to demonstrate the difference between the Fire Golem's tanking ability, watch as I literally can just stand here and pretty much nothing will come and attack me. In fact, if I kind of like run off a little bit, do the same thing I did with the Clay Golem, of course, you'll see that for the most part, most of the monsters are kind of stuck on the Fire Golem. Whereas the difference between the Clay Golem is that the Clay Golem, while the Clay Golem can tank more effectively than the Fire Golem, the main problem with the Clay Golem is that he doesn't hold aggro as well as the Fire Golem. So you will have more monsters chasing after you in general with the Clay Golem because he's not doing as good of a job holding aggro on the larger group. You can see how I have currently like 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 monsters coming to attack me at any given time. Whereas if I throw the Fire Golem out, the Fire Golem's tanking ability is honestly a little bit better, just simply because he can hold aggro. Not because he's tankier, not because he actually does a better job doing, like surviving. In fact, he's much worse. His survivability is actually trash by comparison, but at least he does apply fire damage to the targets, which somehow keeps them, for the most part, tamed toward themselves. So you end up with less monsters coming after you and more monsters coming after the Fire Golem. And it's just simply because he's hitting them all the time. So in the grand scheme of things, the Fire Golem wins for aggro control, but the Clay Golem definitely wins for tankability. So he has high HP, much higher HP than the Fire Golem. He slows targets that hit him, which also in turn multiplies his HP. You could essentially put HP multi, because what this does is it makes it so that the monsters are hitting at a much slower rate, which makes his HP worth more. In other words, like taking a look at the Blood Golem, the Blood Golem has 55,000 HP, which is much more than the Clay Golem. However, the monsters attack at a 72% slower rate with the Clay Golem, which means that, in general, the monsters are attacking more than half the speed that they would be attacking with the Blood Golem, which multiplies the Clay Golem's HP by a rather large percentage. In fact, if you wanted to actually like formulate this into a number, you could pretty much just take his HP at 43,901 and multiply this or add 72% to that, which isn't really quite exactly how it works, but you could easily add 72% to that, saying he has around 75,509 HP because he's able to slow the monsters down, which in general means that the damage that he's taking is far less. Another really good thing about the Clay Golem over the Iron Golem, which was number 2 on the list, is obviously that he is redeployable. So even if you are a relatively low-level Necromancer, and you do not have a high-level Golem yet, he's not super tanky, you don't have maxed out Golem Mastery and things like that, you can, however, still redeploy him at any point. If he were to die, you can redeploy him. Redeploy, redeploy, redeploy. He also has a relatively low mana cost at only 138, which means that you can redeploy him multiple times. He can also be utilized to kill a large number of monsters within the game, utilizing things like Iron Maiden. Now, it is important to realize that the Clay Golem does have one serious drawback. If you are relying on Thorns damage as your main source of damage output, especially in the early part of the game, the Clay Golem can actually be one of the worst choices due to the fact that he slows the monsters down. Think about it like this. If I am a Necromancer utilizing Iron Maiden, or I have a edge bow and I'm utilizing thorns, or maybe I also have something along the lines of like a minion, a mercenary with thorns, and I'm trying to get the most out of my thorns ability. If I slow down the monsters in this regard, this is going to make it very difficult to dish out thorns damage because the monsters are attacking at an increasingly slower rate, which means that I'm not getting hardly any thorns damage. So if you do focus on thorns damage, one thing that you want to avoid at all costs is the Clay Golem. In fact, any golem pretty much works better for thorns. I would highly recommend the fire golem if you're trying to go with a thorns build, because the fire golem doesn't slow things down. It also has a propensity of attracting attention to itself, making it a very good target for smacking the crap out of when it comes to thorns damage. So you're going to get a larger amount of thorns damage in this regard. One of the other problems with thorns damage is that in general, monsters just regenerate the damage away. So even if you do have a considerable amount of thorns damage going out, it doesn't really mean anything because the monsters are just regenerating all your damage anyway. So you have to find a way to arrest regeneration. The only monster or golem, as far as I know, that can actually arrest regeneration is the Iron Golem, utilizing, say, poison damage or open wounds within itself. Which does make it, I think, one of the best choices for thorns. So it's really between the fire golem and the iron golem as far as thorns is concerned. And this is interesting. So you take this and you throw that as a con. Let's see. Let's put redeployable on the clay golem, and then for cons we have to put in the worst choice for thorns slash Iron Maiden. And this is unfortunately the truth. If you are trying to build any kind of Iron Maiden or Thorns Necromancer, and you're banking on that Thorns damage, adding large percentages to your overall output, the Clay Golem is just unfortunately the worst choice for this. Slowing down all the monsters, in fact, Decrepify as well, also has the same problem because Decrepify also slows down the monsters. So it's not something that you want to do if you're trying to get a large amount of Thorns damage. And this is something that comes into play when you're utilizing your summoned army. So you're going to be utilizing, say, Raised Skeleton, Skeleton Mastery, you've got your Golem, you got your Revives, and maybe you have a paltry number of Skeletal Mages because they kind of suck. But overall, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of hits going out on a regular basis from all of your minions. You also have tons and tons of hits coming in as well to your minions, and utilizing thorns is definitely helpful for this. However, slowing down the monsters with Decrepify is one of the worst things that you can do if you're trying to get thorns damage, as well as using the Clay Golem is also terrible because this again slows everything down and makes the monsters attack less frequently, which also in turn makes it so that the monsters are not taking thorns damage as well as they would normally. Now, the Fire Golem does have a little bit of a canceling process for the regeneration, not exactly very high, but because he does apply a pulse to everything around him, he does sort of keep monsters under control with regeneration, but it's not enough, to be perfectly honest. In combination with Thorns, it could be a little bit better, but overall, just regeneration is very hard to deal with on a caster type, and that is unfortunate. There are obviously poison skills that you could potentially use, but Poison Nova is too short at 2 seconds. Poison Explosion is a much higher duration, but unfortunately requires a corpse, and you'd be much better off using Corpse Explosion. And Poison Dagger requires you to use a dagger, which is also unfortunate. I mean, that's pretty much it when it comes to the golems. Definitely in that order. So Blood Golem is definitely the bottom tier. It is the lowest ranked golem on the list and has very little usefulness, to be perfectly honest. It does obviously give you a small passive regen, which is pretty much its only bonus. And if you are in a position where you need that passive regen, it could be potentially useful. But the interesting thing is that you don't have to choose. So if you stack up Golem Mastery instead of stacking up the golems themselves. So, for instance, if you just put 1 point into each golem, and you put 20 points into golem mastery, and then you put 1 point into summon resistance, you will have all 4 golems at a relatively good effectiveness to be able to use for just about anything that you would want. And once you get your plus the skills involved and you get your character set up, you're looking at level 23 to all of your golems, or maybe even higher, depending on how you're set up, 42 golem mastery and 23 summon resist, which is more than enough to use any golem that you want whenever you want to use it. The fire golem is definitely the third on the list, and it really just has to do with the fact that it's relatively weak, and the overall gimmick of how the fire golem works just doesn't really work properly, and this is rather unfortunate. The damage output of the fire golem, even at its maximum, is still pretty pathetic, and it really just has one purpose, which is to be a tank, an aggro pulling tank. It's not a very effective, not a very strong tank. Now, he's not going to survive very much damage, unfortunately, and I was often upset at how often my fire golem would die, even maxed out with all the points in the world, but I was very impressed with how the fire golem managed to hold aggro on large groups of monsters and keep that damage off of me. Second on the list is the Iron Golem for its extreme utility, although the Iron Golem also has other issues, which is that the Iron Golem just isn't very redeployable. You can potentially lose your items, and there's just a lot of issues keeping the Iron Golem in action. I really wish the Iron Golem had more to it when you actually put points into it, but unfortunately the only thing that really goes up is its thorns and its defense, and a tiny bit of HP, which really means that if you want to use Iron Golem, your priority should be Golem Mastery, not the Iron Golem skill itself. Top on the list is definitely the Clay Golem. The Clay Golem is the easiest to use. It is the most useful, just in general, just simply because it applies a slow to the enemy and makes it so that the enemy is not attacking you as quickly. One of the main downsides of the Clay Golem, obviously, is that it has issues with thorns, and there's really not much that you can do about that. The thorns problems with the Clay Golem just don't use the Clay Golem for thorns. You're better off with any of the other golems when it comes to thorns. Iron Golem, you're better off with the Blood Golem, you're better off with the Fire Golem, because it will allow the monster to hit more often and just simply dish out more damage and reflect that damage back to them faster. In fact, a lot of people in early game use the Clay Golem Iron Maiden trick, but if they were utilizing another golem, it would go faster. It would. Now, obviously, the Clay Golem stays alive longer for more hits, but it also takes much longer for Diablo to actually apply those hits due to the slowing effect, which is unfortunate. Another problem with the Clay Golem is that the slowing effect doesn't work versus monsters that are casters. Slow's target doesn't work versus casting types, and it does mean that the Clay Golem tends to be relatively weak versus large numbers of casting monsters, like Golems, for instance, or like Doom Knights and things like that, because the slowing effect does not slow down monsters that are casting effects. It doesn't even slow down players that are casting either, which is also a whole thing. I think that's pretty much it. Let me know what you guys think about the golems. Which one is your favorite? Which one do you like to use? Are you horribly mad at me for ranking the blood golem at the 4th in the list, or the worst golem? I think I might actually rank the blood golem at number 5 in a ranking of 4 golems. Let's put the blood golem at number 5. Are you horribly mad at me for ranking the blood golem at number 5? Is he your favorite buddy in the entire world? Do you think the iron golem should have been higher due to its utility? Do you think that the clay golem doesn't deserve the number 1 spot? Are you mad that the fire golem only got number 3 out of 4, and you think it should have been placed higher? What do you think about the golems? Let me know in the comments below. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals joining me. Be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the channel to support the channel, or, maybe even through Patreon, you could pledge a certain amount of money. That would definitely help me out. As always, keep watching.